Communism holds no serious threat to the United States. Friendly relations in the future may be of great general value. Ambassador Davies was not noted for an acute understanding of the Soviet system, and he had an unfortunate tendency to take what was presented at the trial as the honest and gospel truth. Alright, so if you didn't catch part 1 of this video, no worries, this can totally be watched as a standalone video. This part is far more narrow in scope, whereas the last part was very broad. But to introduce the theme of this part, let's rewind and take a look at the very end of part 1. There's one fact that I see Stalinists constantly citing in their arguments, and it's in regards to the trial of the 21, which took place in 1938. And so this one piece of evidence is that the US ambassador at the time, this guy Joseph Davies, who had attended the entirety of the trial, which, there were plenty of Western observers there, and so he was one of those observers, and he reported back to the US government that the trial had appeared to him to be 100% legit. And this was the US ambassador, the head guy in Moscow representing the US government. Now, these Marxist-Leninists who often use Davies as part of their argument, and it's often the most convincing piece of evidence in their argument, at least for me, it carried a lot of weight, but they likely don't know much at all about Joseph Davies. Because for them, what this guy is he's not a Marxist, he's not a socialist, he's just the typical US ambassador, an ambassador from a major Western capitalist nation. So he's essentially someone without a leftist bias, without any sort of bias towards favoring the Soviet Union, who observed the trial and reported back that it was totally legit. But I'm going to go a little deeper into Davies, who he was, what his motivations were, and we're going to see a bit of a different story there than that from the Stalinist ML perspective. Alright, so let's get started. Joseph Davies was the US ambassador to the USSR from 1936 to 1938. He was appointed by FDR, and the two of them were good friends going back to when they worked in collaboration with each other in Washington, D.C. during Woodrow Wilson's presidency. Davies was not a career diplomat. What he was a corporate lawyer and an international lawyer, and Wilson had brought him in as an economic advisor during his presidency, and he had helped set up the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, and he served as the first chairman of the FTC. But he eventually quit politics and went back to being a lawyer, and he worked on really high-level cases, meaning cases that involved lots of money for really large corporations. So he knew how to inspect factories, how to inspect industrial sites, how to review and analyze documentation and records from managers at such sites and factories. And he obviously had experience in how to analyze government, financial, and economic records as well. And so this experience and know-how was why FDR appointed him as ambassador to the USSR. His mission was to observe and inspect Soviet industry, military industry, and the Soviet economy in general, so that FDR and his administration could get a sense for how large those sectors were, how sophisticated they were, and for how fast those sectors were growing, and ultimately to get a sense for how strong the Soviet military and military technology and capabilities would be in the event of outbreak of war with the Nazis. And his mission was also to get a sense for what side the Soviet Union would come in the coming war in Europe, because they knew it was coming. It was inevitable. So while Davies was in the USSR in Moscow, he attended the trial of the 21, which was officially called the case of the anti-Soviet bloc of rightists and Trotskyites. So this trial was part of the Great Purge of the mid to late 1930s. during Stalin's tenure as General Secretary of the party and leader of the Soviet Union. But this trial was a very public and publicized trial, which was part of a group of trials known as the Moscow trials, which there were 3 of them, and they all involved very high-level people, high-level officials in Soviet government, the Communist Party, Soviet military, and police. And so this was the last of those 3 trials. And it was open to the public, and I believe to the Western press, but it was definitely open to diplomats of all nations. So the 21 individuals in this trial were being accused of treason, espionage, attempting to sabotage the Soviet economy and Soviet industries, and of plotting together with Trotsky of attempting to overthrow the Soviet socialist form of government. So Davies attended this trial. He watched the entire thing. The Western press reported that it was a show trial, same as they had reported on the other 2 Moscow trials. But Davies didn't. He reported back that everything in the trial seemed completely legit to him, and everything seemed completely on the level. That the trial was fair, and the verdict was fair. Now, all of the defendants either pled guilty or eventually admitted their guilt during the trial to all of the charges brought against them. A couple of the guys specified which charges they were pleading guilty to and which charges they were not pleading guilty to. But even those guys pled guilty to being part of this rightist, Trotskyist conspiratorial group and taking part in activities that were meant to lead to the overthrow of the current government, which they acknowledged was a government representative of the political leanings of the vast majority of Soviet citizens. And so Davies reported back that these guys were indeed guilty of the charges brought against them. Now, Davies wrote a book about his experiences in the USSR and his impressions of the Soviet government, the Soviet people, called Mission to Moscow. And the book included a decent section about his impressions of the trial of the 21. And it was published in 1941, just prior to the Nazi military invasion of the Soviet Union. And it was also right around the time of the Lend-Lease Act in the United States, which was an initiative of FDR's that he pushed through Congress, which allowed the US government to send arms, military hardware, to its allies in the new war that was forming in Europe and in Asia as well. So allies such as Britain, the Soviet Union, France, and even China. So Davies' book was then made into a big budget movie called Mission to Moscow, which came out to the American public in theaters and cinemas in 1943. And it was produced by Warner Brothers, major Hollywood studio. And generally speaking, it definitely painted the Soviet Union and the Soviet government at the time in a positive light. So, it came out in 43, but it was mainly about the mid to late 30s. And it expressed to the American public that the Soviet Union was not a threat to the United States of America, its democracy, nor the American way of life. And it included scenes from the trial of 21 specifically, showing some of the defendants admitting their guilt and or not admitting their guilt, but then under further questioning, they ended up caving and thus admitting their guilt. So it expressed to the American public that this trial and the Moscow trials generally were on the level and truthful, and that they were not show trials, as had been reported in the press. I would imagine that Americans who were of thinking age back then all remember that movie, because in 43, the country was involved, the US was involved in this major war going on in Europe. The war was on the minds of all Americans. And this was a movie promoted by the president himself, a very popular president. And it was a movie meant to build camaraderie between the Soviet and American people and instill confidence in the American public that their allies in the war were also good guys, just like them. The Cold War, by the way, was non-existent at this point. It wasn't until a couple years later, 1945, that the Soviets actually entered Berlin and finally ended once and for all the Nazis. So This movie was definitely aimed at rallying the American public around the war effort. Now, while there was a Hollywood actor who played Joseph Davies' character in the film, the actual Joseph Davies, the real-life Joseph Davies, speaks directly to the audience in the introduction to the film. And if it weren't for copyright issues, I would show the introduction and scenes of the film within this video. It seems to be in the public domain in the US, but not in other countries. So I don't want it to get blocked on YouTube or whatever platforms I upload it to. But here's some of what he says at the beginning of the film. He says, "When I was your ambassador in Moscow, I little expected to write Mission to Moscow, but much less to see it on screen. When Germany attacked Russia, the Soviet Union became one of the nations fighting Hitler. And it was a desperate hour. If Hitler were to destroy the Red Armies and to smash the Soviet Union, the three aggressor nations would dominate Europe." Now remember, this is being played in theaters in 1943 while the war is still going on. The three aggressor nations, he's talking about, by the way, Italy, Japan, and Germany, would dominate Europe, Asia, and Africa. The riches of these three continents and the enslaved labor of 3/4 of the population of the world would be harnessed to conquer the rest of the earth. The Americas would be next. Us. Unity among the forces fighting Hitler was vital. Nothing, as I saw it, was more important than that the fighting nations should understand and trust each other. There was so much prejudice and misunderstanding of the Soviet Union, in which I partly shared, that I felt it was my duty to tell the truth about the Soviet Union, as I saw it, for such value as it might have. If I were down there in the audience with you, there are certain things that I might want to know about the man telling this story, so that I could assess the reliability of his judgment and his bias or lack of bias. And then he goes on to tell his family history and his beginnings, basically just to show the audience that he's a normal American guy. And then here he continues, "I have a deep conviction and a firm faith that system," he's talking about the American liberal democratic system of governance, "that system and our government is the best that the world has yet produced for the common man. But while in Russia, I came to have a very high respect for the integrity and the honesty of the Soviet leaders. I respected the honesty of their convictions, and they respected mine. I also came back with a firm conviction that these people were sincerely committed to world peace." I'm definitely not going to argue with him on that one. But he goes on, "and that they and their leaders only wanted to live in a decent world, as good neighbors in a world at peace. That peace has not yet been won. If unity, mutual understanding, and confidence in each other were necessary to win the war, it is still more necessary to win the peace. For there can be no durable peace without an agreement among those nations who have won the war that they will project that peace and maintain that peace and protect that peace. That is why I wrote Mission to Moscow." Okay, and then I'm going to skip a bit of what he says, but you can watch the whole introduction in the actual film. But here he goes on, "Without prejudice or partisanship, I offer to my fellow Americans the facts as I saw them, while United States Ambassador to the Soviet Union. No leaders of a nation have been so misrepresented and misunderstood as those in the Soviet government during those critical years between the two world wars. I hope that my book will help to correct that misunderstanding in presenting Russia and its people in their gallant struggle to preserve the peace until ruthless aggression made war inevitable." Okay, so what do we take from Davies' words in regards to what we're talking about, which is, in a general sense in this whole video, Stalin's crimes or repressions or lack thereof, and in this section specifically, part 2, the Great Purge of the late 1930s, for which Davies was present in the Soviet Union? Well, what we get from his opening statement is that regardless of if he's being genuine or not about his takes on the Soviet leadership at the time and the validity of the trial, etc., regardless, he has a motivation to paint the Soviet leadership at the time, to paint Stalin and to paint the purge repressions, and specifically the trial of the 21, in a positive light to the American people. And that motivation of his, he actually just told us straight up, is to defeat Hitler, as well as Japan and Italy, which together form the Axis powers. And he's concerned, as he told us, that if not stopped by force, the Nazis might conquer all of Europe, Asia, Africa, and then the Americas. And in the old world at that time, meaning Asia, Africa, and Europe, the Soviet Union was the greatest force industrially and militarily that could fight and combat Hitler's attempt and the Axis attempt to conquer the world. And it's very true that the Soviet Union at that time was the greatest military force on those three continents, aside from maybe the Nazis. And I also agree with Davies that Hitler wanted to conquer the world and that he wanted to make slaves out of many people who weren't either German, Scandinavian, or part of the Anschluss ethnicity pool. So Hitler was a major threat to world peace and to a decent life for most of the peoples of the world. But regardless if Davies would have been proven correct regarding Hitler aiming to enslave the majority of the ethnicities and cultures and nationalities of the world, it still shows us a strong motivation, Davies' anti-fascism and anti-Nazism, which could have been compelling him to do whatever it takes to convince the American people that the Soviet leadership and Stalin are just straight up good. Straight up good without any major drawbacks that might cause the American people to cancel Stalin. If the American public were to cancel Stalin at this point, whether in 41 or in 43, and keep in mind that we're dealing with an America that in the previous decade had been engrossed in a large political movement pushing for a neutral America. An America that would not get involved in European wars. That's what the neutrality movement of the 30s was mainly about. It was about keeping the US out of European wars and European disagreements. So that if the American public at this time were to cancel Stalin, then Davy knows that that could easily hinder the cooperation between the Soviet and American militaries, as well as, at this time, the Soviet and British militaries, which any lack of cooperation between those said militaries could have easily resulted in the Nazis and the Axis conquering the world. And Davies is well aware of that. Just from his opening statement in the movie, it's glaringly obvious that Davies has a motivation to lie to the American public. And look, not all lies told by leaders of countries are bad lies. In this case, it would be a lie for a very valiant purpose. The reason why in history that leaders sometimes have to tell these good lies is because people are generally stupid. And by that, I don't mean that they're stupid in regards to everything, but I do mean that in general, they know very little about politics, geopolitics, and history, and those three things put together. And so, you can't just get in front of a camera and try to explain to them the nuanced, complicated truth. You have to basically water it down and just lie. Now, I'm not concluding here at this point in the video that Davies was necessarily lying to the public about the trial of the 21, Stalin, and his purges. I'm just saying that he had a major motivation to lie. And in his own words, the ones we just listened to, he made that abundantly clear. And I also want to mention that if you do go and watch the film, you're going to notice that there are clear good guys and bad guys. Not only was he painting the Soviet people and leadership as good, he was also painting the diplomats from the Axis nations, as well as some other German characters that made appearances in the film, as just bad. And it's a 1940s film, so the propaganda is just very overt. as compared to propaganda today. All right, anyway, let's check out some other quotes. Here we have a small quote from Davies from one of his memos. It would have been from 1938, just prior to wrapping up his ambassadorship in Moscow. He wrote, "Communism holds no serious threat to the United States. Friendly relations in the future may be of great general value." Okay, here we have a quote from Charles Bohlen. He was appointed to be on the diplomatic team to the Soviet Union by FDR, and he was on the team when Davies served as, the head diplomat for the US in Moscow. And he also, like Davies, observed the trial of the 21. And so he said in regards to Davies, "Ambassador Davies was not noted for an acute understanding of the Soviet system, and he had an unfortunate tendency to take what was presented at the trial as the honest and gospel truth. I still blush when I think of some of the telegrams he sent to the State Department about the trial. I can only guess at the motivation for his reporting. He ardently desired to make a success of a pro-Soviet line and was probably reflecting the views of some of Roosevelt's advisors to enhance his political standing at home." I would say Davies' motivation was more about fighting Hitler. He wasn't a career diplomat, and he wasn't seeking any sort of political career going forward. So I do think his motivations were about stopping fascism and stopping Hitler. And I think he had a secondary motivation of peace with the Soviet Union once fascism was beaten back and the war ended. I do think him and FDR genuinely wanted that, and I'll get to that later. And in a moment, I'm going to come back to Bohlen. I'm going to cover Bohlen quite a bit, his credentials, his political leanings, so that you can see who the guy was who said this really unfavorable quote about Davies' knowledge of the Soviet Union and about his motivations. But first, let's take a look at another one of Davies' remarks. And this one comes from a trip that Davies took to Moscow in 1943, so just after the release of the movie. He was no longer the ambassador. He had moved on from that role 5 years prior, but FDR sent him personally to relay a private message to Stalin, which he didn't want Churchill to catch wind of. So Davies hadn't been in Moscow since '38, and when he interacted with the US diplomatic team there in Moscow, he said he was surprised to find the same hostility and prejudice amongst that diplomatic corps towards the Soviet leadership as he had witnessed amongst them back in 37-38. And the reason he was surprised is likely because, as compared to 37-38, the US was now, in 43, in an official alliance with the Soviet Union. Back home in the US, people at that time were calling Stalin Uncle Joe. So there was a friendship between the two governments and between the peoples of the two nations, which hadn't existed back in 1938. So I think Davies was surprised that that feeling of friendship and feeling of being in an alliance with the Soviet Union hadn't transferred over to the American diplomatic corps, the diplomatic team in Moscow. So here it says that he complained to the diplomatic team that any public criticism of the Soviets, who were America's ally, might be harmful to the war effort. And actually, Davies, recounted that he complained to them for that reason in a manuscript that he wrote later on about his experiences. And that manuscript is now in the Library of Congress. So yet again, we see Davies worried about Stalin and the Soviet government getting canceled by the American public if they were to hear certain things. And he's worried about it for the principal reason that it might harm the war effort. Okay, so like I mentioned before, Bohlen was appointed to the US diplomatic team to the Soviet Union in 1934 by FDR. And apparently, this was actually the first year that the US had a diplomatic team and an embassy in the Soviet Union. So, going back to what I said about FDR and Davies genuinely wanting peace with the Soviets once the war were to end, I don't think it's any small thing that FDR was the first American president to send a diplomatic team to Moscow. In any case, 3 or 4 years prior to 1934, Bohlen had been working in Paris, where he began studying Russian and where he became a Soviet specialist. So in other words, he studied up on all sorts of aspects of culture, government, political structure, etc. of the USSR during those few years. In terms of him learning the Russian language, by the time he reached Moscow in 1934, he was completely fluent in Russian, to the point where he served as FDR's interpreter at the Tehran and Yalta conferences. And then later on, Bohlen served as interpreter for Truman and Stalin at the Potsdam Conference. So to be an interpreter in general, you have to be bilingual. And to serve as interpreter for the President of the US at a critically important meeting with the Soviet Union, you'd have to be almost flawless in the second language. So I'm mentioning all this stuff about Bohlen because he's the guy who smeared Davies' take on the trial of the 21. So I'm showing you what kind of guy he is. So it's said that when he was on the diplomatic team in Moscow, he was at odds with a lot of the more conservative hawks. After the war in 1946, so just after the war, he very vocally disagreed with this other guy on the diplomatic team in Moscow by the name of George Kennan. Kennan was more conservative, and he wanted to implement a policy of Soviet containment, whereas Bohlen said that it would be better to accommodate the Soviets a bit and allow them to have a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. And if we take a look at the back of Robert Conquest's book, The Great Terror, the second edition, which came out in 1990, so the very book we were looking at in part 1 of this video, we don't see laudatory comments regarding the book from Bohlen. Instead, we see laudatory comments from George Kennan regarding Robert Conquest's wonderful piece of pure propaganda. Kennan wrote, "One comes away filled with a sense of the relevance and immediacy of old questions." Okay, now in 1953, President Eisenhower appoints Bohlen as ambassador to the Soviet Union. So he's now the head of the diplomatic team in Moscow. However, this is still during the time of the anti-communist McCarthy blacklists, so that when Eisenhower wants to appoint Bohlen as ambassador to the USSR, he has to go before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to be questioned regarding his work at the Yalta Conference. The next day, his hearing makes front page for the newspaper. Senator McCarthy smears Bohlen. John Foster Dulles, who was Eisenhower's new Secretary of State, not to the public as McCarthy did, but now on public record we know that he also was strongly against Bohlen being appointed ambassador to the USSR. Now, John Foster Dulles was an aggressive anti-communist geopolitically, and he was instrumental in cooperating with his brother Allen Dulles, who was head of the CIA, in orchestrating the coup d'etat on democratically elected Mossadegh in Iran, as well as orchestrating the coup d'etat on democratically elected Arbenz in Guatemala. And he also sent troops to first support and then relieve the French in their ongoing fight against Ho Chi Minh and the communists in Vietnam. Not to mention that he openly praised Hitler in the 1930s, prior to the time when it became politically incorrect in the US to do so. So between the reports of him constantly arguing with the conservatives on the diplomatic team in Moscow during the 30s and 40s, and then his public battles with Kennan, the McCarthy smearing, then John Foster Dulles. So the point is, we seem to keep seeing Bohlen at odds with conservative imperialist hawks. So that it's very unlikely that he publicly and overtly disagreed with Davies' take on the trial of the 21 because he himself was a conservative hawk. In any case, despite the McCarthy smears, Bohlen is confirmed by the US Senate as US ambassador to the Soviet Union in 1953 by a landslide vote of 74-13, which I hope the significance of that isn't lost on people. To be smeared by Senator McCarthy during the height of McCarthy's hearings regarding communists in the US government and in other areas of US society as well And to still be confirmed in a landslide vote as US ambassador to the Soviet Union speaks incredibly highly, basically, to Bohlen's credentials as a diplomat in Moscow. And in regards to the McCarthy hearings and the anti-communist fervor that was going on at the time, Bohlen said a miasma of fear and suspicion infected America. So that's what he thought of all the blacklisting and the McCarthy hearings. Now, Dulles, even though he didn't want Bohlen as ambassador to the Soviet Union, he publicly ended up supporting him, basically because his boss Eisenhower really wanted Bohlen as the ambassador. But things between Bohlen and Dulles didn't go too well in the following years, so that Dulles forced Bohlen's resignation from his position as ambassador to the USSR in 1957. So once again, an imperialist hawk is anti-Bohlen. And Bohlen says later on regarding Dulles, he did not want me in Washington because he would have had to put me in a policy-making job. So just to bring it all back after this tangent on Bohlen, Davies had said about the trial of the 21 that the Kremlin's fears were well justified. And here again is Bohlen's remarks on Davies in regards to Davies' assessment of the trial of the 21. I'll read it again now that we know Bohlen's history. Ambassador Davies was not noted for an acute understanding of the Soviet system, and he had an unfortunate tendency to take what was presented at the trial as the honest and gospel truth. I still blush when I think of some of the telegrams he sent to the State Department about the trial. I can only guess at the motivation for his reporting. He ardently desired to make a success of a pro-Soviet line. So with leftists, the main problem is that they often view FDR as just this standard American president who happened to be pushed left by socialists and communists and trade unions during the Great Depression, and who essentially made a deal with the American and Western capitalists to throw some scraps to the common American people in order to save capitalism as the system of governance and economics on the whole. And so they often think of him basically as a puppet of the American and Western oligarchs. And so if you think of FDR in that way, then you're going to think of the ambassador that he appointed to the Soviet Union as just another representative of the liberal democratic capitalist system who is ultimately just representing the capitalist oligarchs in their imperialist aims. And so, time permitting, the future segments of this little video series will be heading into the direction of FDR, and to show that this view of him, the perspective that I just laid out, is really not true. And for any libertarians watching, it'll also show that the standard libertarian viewpoint on FDR, that he was also, from another sort of angle, just the puppet of the bankster oligarchs, is also incorrect. And I may also cover a little bit more of the trial of the 21 and Stalin's repressions in the late 30s, because all I've really done in this video is show that Davies was likely lying about his opinion on the trial. But in any case, where this little video series is heading is towards FDR. And that's it for this video, so thanks for watching. I hope you found it useful. Please subscribe and like, and I'll see you in the next video.